Alright, so recently I read a screen name on Reddit, and the screen name was Sauron Represents Technology. And I disagree with this reading. I don't think that's what's. I don't think that's the most interesting way of interpreting what Sauron represents. Sort of off the cuff and without notes, it seems there's a popular reading of Tolkien that he was traumatized by living through the World Wars, and he sort of attributes the bloody nature of the wars, the horror of those wars, to technology. It's reasonable that somebody in Tolkien's position could have reached those readings, or would have written the books that Tolkien wrote as a way of blaming technology for the horrors of war. But I think the only interesting support for that view is the scouring of the Shire. So you have the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, and Lord of the Rings, and when you want to support the view that Sauron represents technology, it seems to me that your main support is the scouring of the Shire. Because when Frodo and the Hobbit squadron of the Fellowship of the Ring arrive back in the Shire, what they find is that the Shire is being mechanized poorly. So the mill has been repurposed into a better mill, or a more mechanical mill. Okay, so generally I think an interpretation such as Sauron represents tech, an interpretation is good of a text when it lights up a lot of the text. When I hear that Sauron represents tech, okay, if I'm being in good faith, okay, you could think about the rings as also representing like a particular instance of technology and saying, well, Sauron propagated the rings. So that's an example of tech. Okay. But generally, when a good interpretation of a text is going to light up many examples. As if you read through the text again with that interpretation in mind, then you're going to be reading passages and saying, lo, this passage supports the interpretation. Or, in support of the interpretation, you're going to have many examples from the text that you can call forward as evidence. So I'm going to try to present as an alternative view to the idea that Sauron represents tech. I'm going to try to present I'm going to try to present a different view, and it's going to call forth a lot of evidence, or a lot of passages from the Legendarium. Now, notably, most of the passages that I'm going to be quoting are not from Lord of the Rings, because I think, or I know, that Tolkien wrote another book, The Silmarillion, and I think that The Silmarillion is far more important to understanding The Lord of the Rings than The Lord of the Rings itself is. Or maybe that's not what I should say, but I think if you're trying to interpret The Lord of the Rings as a standalone work, you kind of misunderstand what the Legendarium is. So most of my examples are going to come from the Silmarillion. If you have not read the Silmarillion, I'm going to be speaking as if you've read the Silmarillion, but I'm going to have to present the passages or the scenes for my own consideration regardless. If you've read the Silmarillion, you might roll your eyes in exasperation at how long I spend explaining the scenes. If you have not read the Silmarillion, then you might get an adequate understanding of the scenes that I'm talking about from my setting of the scene. Okay. So I've given myself some notes because I've tried to make this video several times and I have about 6 hours of footage of me analyzing scenes but never actually reaching the point. So I've got some notes. Alright, so my notes ask me, can a representation of a thing be what it is? Sauron is the end of a cycle begun by Feanor. This is a grouping of events and not an interpretation. The interpretation takes place in naming the cycle. Okay, so let's ignore the question for now. What I'm observing here, Sauron is the end of a cycle begun by Feanor. This is like a minimally interpretive examination of the Legendarium. So, in the Legendarium, God creates the world. We're just going to call Eru God. God creates the world. Okay? God, in his wisdom, creates Valinor in the west, and he creates Middle-earth. He sets the Valar down in Valinor. The Valinor wait until the elves emerge in Middle-earth. And then the Valar try to take all of the elves out of Middle-earth and relocate them into Valinor. Some time passes. Feanor constructs the silmarils. The silmarils are stolen by Melkor. Feanor and his 7 sons lead a mighty contingent of elves to Middle-earth to reclaim the silmarils. The elves arrive back in Middle-earth with the knowledge of the Valar, and they wage war against Melkor. Men, traveling west from the east and south, encounter the elves and become their servants, and help them to wage war against Melkor. They defeat Melkor. That's not quite right. They wage war against Melkor for a long time, and then the Valar come out of the west and just crush Melkor in a day, invalidating all of their efforts. And the Valar destroy most of Melkor's servants, but Sauron remains, hiding in a mountain maybe. Sauron hides until the Valar are gone, and then he goes to the east, and he gathers men to his cause. The Numenoreans arrive at Sauron and try to put him down. They take him back to Numenor in chains And then Sauron destroys Numenor. And then Sauron goes back to Middle-earth. The last alliance occurs. The last alliance is made to resist Sauron. Sauron is defeated. The ring is taken from him by Isildur. Isildur dies in a ditch. The ring floats off. A hobbit finds it. The hobbit gets the ring stolen. The stealer of the ring passes the ring to his nephew. The nephew travels to Mordor and destroys the ring. And that is the end of the cycle. So in a literal sense, if you're just naming the events in the story, there is a clear connection in the material circumstances of Middle-earth that are established by Feanor, and the playing out of those circumstances results in Sauron at Mordor when the ring is destroyed. So Sauron is the end of a cycle begun by Feanor. Okay, you could say, okay, well, it wasn't one cycle, it was multiple cycles. Well, okay, well, if we want to say, if we marked the occasion where Feanor came to Middle-earth and we marked the occasion where Sauron died due to the destruction of the ring, this is just a grouping of events. It's not an interpretation. The interpretation takes place in the naming of the cycle. So, supposing we wanted to say that Sauron's story begins when Feanor departs from Valinor and arrives in Middle-earth, what do we want to name this cycle? If we wanted to name this cycle technology, and thereby identify Sauron with technology, we probably would not bother with plucking out Feanor. We wouldn't think about Feanor's traversing the sea to Middle-earth. And we wouldn't think about the silmarils. But you see, if you've read the Silmarillion, here's what I'm thinking. If you've read the Silmarillion and taken it seriously, the moment I said we wouldn't take into account the silmarils, then you would step back and say, wait a minute. You're reading the Legendarium and discounting the silmarils? That doesn't make any sense. Because the point of the Silmarillion is to show that the entirety of the unfolding of the world is related to the silmarils. Alright, so we're gonna make an intricate point here, and we're going to use it to name the cycle that was begun by Feanor's arrival in Middle-earth and was ended when Sauron was destroyed. So here is the intricate observation. I'm going to lay out some more history in Middle-earth here that we'll work with. So after the Valar extracted as many of the elves as they could from Middle-earth, they took them to Valinor. And what I want to say about the elves in Valinor is that they were all trying not to call in too much philosophy as reinforcement here. I want to say they were all being in itself, or being for itself. They were all pursuing their own purposes, and not a single one of them made a claim on the being of any other. And what do I mean by this? I mean that every elf in Valinor was doing exactly whatever he or she wanted to do. Doing exactly whatever elves wanted to do, frolicking freely in Valinor. Not one of them had instrumental control over another one of the elves. Instrumental control. Now, this raises a kind of contradiction. Because generally when we think about lords, we think about commands. So I'm thinking of instrumental control as a kind of extension of the delivery of a command. So you are a lord over another because you, the lord, issue a command, and the subject, the elf, accepts the command and acts on it, satisfies it. There were lords in Valinor. So, for instance, Tol Eressëa, one of the islands off the coast of Valinor, had Thingol as a lord. And there's the Lord Fingolfin, though I don't remember what portion of Valinor he controlled. And it doesn't really make sense to imagine a lord without imagining also the issuance of a command. And it is difficult to imagine the issuance of a command without imagining someone being made an instrument of that command. So, if you hear a command, and you act so as to satisfy the conditions of that command, you are being made an instrument of the command, one would think. When does a command not reduce its recipient to an instrument? Oh. Yeah, let me cover this first. Alright, so this parenthetical note is Adam and Eve with dirt under their toenails. What can we legitimately say about referencing lordship in Valinor? So the observation I'm trying to encode with this is there are a lot of things you could say about the story of Genesis or the story of the Garden of Eden, or that you could say about Adam and Eve, that are not explicitly stated in the text. So, for instance, we know that Adam and Eve are nude in the Garden of Eden because they haven't yet conceived of clothing. And they're walking around in the dirt. So we know there's dirt under their toenails. Okay. Why am I raising this observation? Well, it's not ever referenced in the text that there's dirt under their toenails. If the text at some point explicitly said Adam and Eve had dirt under their toenails, there would have been books written about that phrase. And I know this because if I take any sentence within the story of Genesis and I look back on history, there's going to have been a book written about it. Because that is the extent to which the story of Genesis has been analyzed by people who are obsessed with what it means, right? But here I am discerning what must have been true about the characters in the story. So, if we take this back to the lords, the fact that there's Lord Thingol, right, what is reasonable for me to take as implicit in the establishing of a lord? Well, I think it is implicit even in the statement of a lord that he delivers commands. I mean, it's loosely implicit in the statement of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden that they have dirt under their toenails, right? And yet at no point would I can't quite imagine what interpretation of Genesis I would have to be making so that it was relevant that there's dirt under the toenails of Adam and Eve, right? And yet here I am about to rely on the implicit fact that if you have a lord, there is the issuance of a command. Well, let's take a step back and talk about why I am about to discuss the issuance of a command. So Feanor is in Valinor, and so is Melkor. Morgoth Bauglir, the dark enemy of the world. He has been chained in Valinor because he had been off in Middle-earth doing bad things, and the Valar didn't like it. Okay, but he escapes. Prior to his escape, Feanor has just constructed the silmarils. And the silmarils they're gems, to speak plainly, but they are the peak of craftsmanship. They are the most beautiful things that have ever been made. And for all anyone knows in Valinor, they are the most beautiful things that will ever be made. The silmarils took some of the light of the trees of Valinor, the two trees in Valinor that are most beautiful. Feanor inscribed their light into gems. And I'm probably not giving them adequate weight because we're treating them as a literary object. But at any rate, Feanor has just constructed the silmarils, and I guess you can surmise their significance because one of the few books that Tolkien actually wrote is named the Silmarillion, right? Anyway, Feanor has just constructed the silmarils. Melkor, when he breaks free of his chains, steals the silmarils. Well, he breaks free from his chains, he destroys the two trees in Valinor, and then he goes to Feanor's house and steals the silmarils. Feanor gets summoned by the Valar to the council of the Valar, and the Valar ask him, if you give us the silmarils, we can remake the trees. We can resurrect the two trees if you give us the silmarils. While Feanor is there, at the council. Melkor goes to his house and steals the silmarils. Feanor says, I will not give you the silmarils. I may have just committed a grammatical... he tells the Valar, no, I will not give you the silmarils. Okay. Now, what I want to do, though the notes don't really guide me towards this, what I want to do is say that the Valar requesting the silmarils constitutes the first sin in Middle-earth, or the first sin in Arda, in the world. But my way of explaining why the request for the silmarils constitutes the first sin relies on an interpretation of what lordship was in Valinor. However, I have to pee, which is going to interrupt this video, so I'll be right back and we'll try to get through this question. All right. So what I basically, or what I'm trying to get at, trying to present, is the idea that the first sin in the Tolkien Legendarium is the request by the Valar for the silmarils. And sin is kind of a cheap word here. So let's expand upon it. It is When the Valar request the silmarils from Feanor, it is the first occasion that has ever occurred where the works and labors of one of the children of Iluvatar will be taken and used for a purpose other than the one for which it was constructed. And this is to say that one of the children of Iluvatar will be made into an instrument of a purpose other than the purpose that the child itself constructed for itself. So, in all of the history of the Legendarium, the Valar have never requested anything of the elves. They did not request that the elves arrive at Valinor, that they follow them into Valinor. They said, if you follow me, you will arrive in Valinor. And so the elves followed them freely. And then they arrived in Valinor as promised. And Ulmo, Aula, Manwë, they taught the elves, but at no point did they request of the elves anything, because none of their designs relied upon anything the elves could do, or what they could give to the Valar. It is only when Feanor has constructed the silmarils that the Valar have anything, that the elves have made anything that is relevant to the purposes of the Valar, and that can be used by the Valar. Okay, but this is where the lords come in, because there are lords among the elves. And it is intrinsic to the presence of a lord, or the existence of a lord, that it is issuing commands. So how are the elven lords different from the Valar requesting the silmarils from Feanor? The difference is that the requests by the lords to the elves, it's kind of like in a role-playing game. So let's imagine that I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons with friends. And on a lark, I say that my character is a sniveling servant of one of the other players, or one of the other players' characters. Okay. In the proper expansion of that character into the world, when the other person's player character issues a command to my player character, there's no contradiction present in following the command, because I have already said that my character is a sniveling servant. Okay, what is the point I'm making here? Wish I'd made more notes for this idea. If I find a leader whose purposes are in harmony with my own purposes, receiving a command from that leader is not turning me into an instrument. I'm trying to reach some strange distinction here. I become, or an agent becomes an instrument when a command is issued and the agent to whom the command was issued recognizes that following that command is not the same thing as pursuing its own purpose. And then the agent follows the command anyway. So the Lord issues a command to the servant. If you are just playing a role-playing game and you're saying, my ideal, what I want to make of myself, is the maximal illumination of the purposes of my Lord. Most of the time when you receive a command from your Lord, you will be able to interpret it in terms of your vision of the Lord. And then it will make sense to follow it. There will be no contradiction in your mind concerning whether the command should be followed or not. You simply follow the command. You say, following this command is the next among the things I always already wanted to do in pursuit of my own purpose, where my own purpose is the illumination of my Lord. Right? So what I'm imagining in Valinor is a bunch of role players where they have lords and they obey the commands of the lords, not because they feel any compulsion to do so, not because failing to obey the commands would result in punishment or, I don't know, like depromotion or demotion, but because their own vision of themselves is expanded by the following of the command. And this is the difference between the issuance of a command by one of the lords of Valinor and one of the issuances of a command to Feanor by the Valar. The lords organize the actions of the people below them, but none of the people below them, none of the elves below them, at any point think that there's something wrong with the commands. They're not compelled by the commands. They receive the commands and say, yes, that is the thing I always already should have been doing. Calling a little bit of philosophy in there, which I'm trying to avoid. But Feanor receives a command by the Valar. Not a command, but a request. It's basically the same thing. The Valar request the silmarils. And Feanor does not want to deliver the silmarils to the Valar. He does. It's a strange circumstance. It's a circumstance where if he freely gave the silmarils to the Valar, he would not have been made an instrument of their purposes. Because he would have been like one of the servants of the lords, who has issued a command and followed it freely. But given that he was not inclined to follow the command, the request became something different. The request was make yourself an instrument of our purposes. And Feanor declined. They requested the silmarils, and Feanor said, "No, they are mine. You can't have them, and you can't put them towards any purposes that you previously imagined." And this, I mean, there's a question of interpretation here concerning which was the first sin. Was it the request for the silmarils, or was it Feanor declining the request? But at any rate, the first sin occurred at this Council of the Valar, to which they invited Feanor. And I mean, we might make some side observations here that this was the first occasion where an elf was ever invited to the Council of the Valar. But I'm not going to go down that. Okay, but as we can see from my notes, I have already reached an interpretation here. It was the Valar that committed the first sin. They did something unlike what any of the elven lords had done to their vassals. The elven lords had never issued a request that, when received by a vassal, would make the vassal question whether the command should be followed. Right. The lords, they order their domains, but it's like they are not people. It's like they are a locus of commands. And everyone beneath them recognizes that for the proper ordering of the world, for the proper construction of this D&D roleplay experience, there needs to be someone who issues commands. Because things need to be done. And there need to be people who follow the commands. Because there are things that need to be done. And there's no conflict. There are no experienced contradictions between one's own vision of the world and what one is being asked to do. It is only once the Valar request the silmarils from Feanor that there is a contradiction between one's own vision of the world and what one is being asked to do. Anyway, I don't think this adequately answered the question of, like, the lordship structure in Valinor is not discussed at all. So maybe it's a little bit, tiny bit illegitimate to call that as a primary witness for my interpretation. But it all seems reasonable enough. So let's go ahead and proceed. Alright. Why the Valar, unlike Melkor, can be judged, and how they committed the first sin. Well, we've seen how they committed the first sin. Why can they be judged unlike Melkor? Well, let's go back and recall some of the creation myth. Actually, I don't know if I even want to look at this note yet. Maybe skip ahead to the next note. Yeah, okay, let's skip ahead to the next note. Okay, so the next note is Melkor and Discord. Harmony through absence of contact. So, when the world was being created by God, God created the world by singing. God, in the before times, gathered to himself all of the angels, all of the Valar, the Aenir, or whatever. And he began to sing. And many or all of the other Aenir began to sing with him in harmony. But Melkor, ever the contrarian, Melkor introduced, I don't know, if I recalled my music theory a little bit better here, I'd make some music theory jokes. Melkor presented minor fucking sevenths or something. Oh, apologies for the... Anyway, Melkor sang in discord to God. And God said, Melkor, the only thing you've done is prolonged this symphony that I've constructed. Because however conflicting the discord is, there is a construction of harmony that explains the unfolding of that discord. I'm trying to think of a musical example I could raise here that would make this, I don't know, I could try to reference jazz or something, but it's like if you were playing in C major, and then someone played G flat, there's some progression of harmony that incorporates the G flat, right? And basically that's what God says to Melkor. It's, the only thing you've done is made this symphony more magnificent. Because you have demanded of me that I explain how you incorporate the discord you've introduced into the harmony that I am singing. Okay. Now, in my own interpretation, Melkor is like the weather. He's part of creation itself. It is, I think, incorrect to think about Melkor as being an agent in the world, which is a strange thing to say because he is a character, and to each character we ascribe agency. But Melkor is not an agent, even though there is the appearance of him in particular circumstances and the appearance of him deciding things. But Melkor is more like part of the fabric of the world. Right, so as an example of Melkor deciding things, Melkor has recently stolen the silmarils. Okay, well, stealing is an agential action, right? If you drop something on the shore of a river and the river carries it away, we don't accuse the river of stealing, but we do accuse Melkor of stealing the silmarils. Okay, then Melkor did not steal the silmarils, because Melkor is not an agent. Melkor took them away. Because Melkor is part of the unfolding of the world. He is part of the world itself. Okay, why did I just spend so much time on that? Harmony through the absence of contact. So, we might say of me, the person speaking, that my actions are in harmony. No, better to make this a musical observation. Let's say somebody is playing in C major in one recital hall, and there's another recital hall much in the distance where somebody is playing music in what would be the worst thing? Like F sharp major? No, G sharp? Whatever, I don't know, whatever the maximally disharmonious key would be that you could play. The whatever the most disharmonious interval would be for an entire key. You could imagine two people playing those keys in distant locations. And we could say they are in harmony. And the reason we would say they're in harmony is because discord is a characteristic of sound in a place. Right? There's discord because you have C and C sharp playing at the same time. Excuse me. Harmony through absence of contact. So what am I trying to point out here? You have in Valinor a few lords and their followers, and there is no contact between them. This seems to contradict the suggestion that the lords are issuing commands to their followers. Right? There's no conflict in the issuing of commands by the lords to their vassals. But there's not an absence of conflict because they have the same vision for the unfolding of the future. It's like they are looking at the same thing, the continuation of the house of the Lord, and they are both acting towards it. It is not that they are in conflict and harmonizing through effort. It is not that this idea, why Feanor fulfills Melkor's pursuit more fully than himself. Melkor tried to introduce discord into the world, and what he did in order to introduce this discord into the world was become the weather. Right, like if you experience a hurricane arriving off your coast, it looks like discord. Because the vision of harmony is that you look at your circumstance and everything is proceeding as anticipated. Melkor disrupted the anticipated unfolding of the world but he did not therefore introduce any kind of discord amongst the children of Iluvatar. He became the enemy. Morgoth Bauglir, the dark enemy of the world, and he united all of the elves against him. This is different from what Feanor did. Feanor really introduced discord into the world by creating the silmarils, or the Valar introduced discord into the world by requesting the silmarils from Feanor. I think I expected more connective sinew here before I arrived at this next note, but let's try to forge ahead. The Valar requested the silmarils from Feanor, and notably, his answer to that request is completely irrelevant materially, because if he had said, okay, you can have the silmarils, then he would have, walked back to his house and found that the silmarils were not there. Okay. He walked back to his house and found that the silmarils were not there. And he discerned that Melkor had stolen them. And he said, I'm going to have the silmarils back. And he said this loudly, and all the elves around him agreed. And then Feanor said, I'm going to go to the harbor and acquire the boats so that I can travel to Middle-earth and get back the silmarils. And all of the elves who heard this agreed. And so he began to walk towards the havens, and he had a mighty train of elves around him. And the train of elves arrived at the harbor. And they requested the boats. They said, hey, we need boats to go over to Middle-earth. You made these boats for a reason. You at the harbor. It would be confusing and self-destructive as if you made these boats and that are capable of traversing the sea and you just never use them for that purpose. That'd be real strange, wouldn't it? But they said, we're not going to give you the boats. And Feanor said, you're going to give us the boats. And while he said that, he stabbed the harbor master in the chest with a knife. And this was the first kinslaying. And then the rest of the rest of the unfolding of the kinslaying, I think, doesn't matter that much. What I think would happen in this kind of circumstance is that the idea of an elf slaying another elf would be so foreign both to the followers of Feanor and also the people in the harbor, that when Feanor stabbed the harbor master in the heart, everyone else would have their experience shattered. Like you arrive behind the harbor master on the harbor, and you don't even have in the back of your mind the possibility that an elf can slay another elf. It's not even an idea that you could conceive of. It doesn't even occur to you, that possibility. And then Feanor stabs the harbor master in the heart. Now, how do you react to this? I think there's a big difference between people who can conceive of murder and who can't. With regards to their response to the experiencing of murder. I think if you could not conceive of murder to begin with and then you experienced it, I think you would begin to vomit. I think you would collapse. Or, I don't know, instinct would take over and you would begin to fight. But at any rate, some unfolding of the first kinslaying occurred. I suspect the people who experienced it jumped off the harbor and drowned themselves or swam to shore after the water refreshed them or something. The question we're trying to answer here is whether the first murder was also accompanied by the second and third and fourth and fifth and so on. What I like to imagine is that exactly one murder occurred at the harbor, but the story doesn't really tell us. It doesn't actually say that a battle occurred and that, tens of people were killed. Anyway, Feanor leads his group to the harbor, and they seize the boats because Feanor is going to have the silmarils back. Now, we're going to have to take a kind of third-person perspective. We can't just keep following Feanor because we are interpreting and we are not witnessing, We're not trying to say, this is exactly what happened. We're trying to say, here is a describing of what happened. All right. So, many elves followed Feanor to Middle-earth. And they formed a few kingdoms. What were the kingdoms? Gondolin, Doriath, Nogothrond. Is that it? And these kingdoms were not in conflict with each other, but they were not in accordance with each other. They did not have a single commander. And it is indeed, though I would have to quote the text here, and I could quote the text here, there was not a common order concerning their purposes. They were not several facets of the same kingdom of elves in Middle-earth. They were separate kingdoms with their own purposes. Most blatantly demonstrated by Doriath, though Thingol. Yeah, we get to that note down here. The kingdoms of elves who arrived in Middle-earth, they were not of one mind. They were of several minds. And here, I guess, we see the kind of multiplication of what Feanor, of one way of reading what Feanor was trying to achieve. What Feanor wanted, I think, was conflict between lords and vassals. I think Feanor saw the relation between the elves and the Valar as a lord and vassal relationship. And he also saw the lords among the elves and their vassals. And he thought, well, I have to pee again, so I'm going to take another break. I'll be right back. The extirpation of Valinor in Middle Earth. I think we're gonna have to make new notes here. I think back here we should go to the first quote that I had up here. So the context for this quote is that it's taken from Numenoreans, which is the story of Turin and Yeaner, his sister. Sador is Turin's servant, manservant. Turin, I'm just presenting this because it's funny. Turin, when he speaks about Sador, he calls him like Lala. He calls him some name that basically means peg leg, which is very funny. Sador served an elven lord, went to war, and had his leg cut off. And so he's, a peg leg. And Turin calls him peg leg. I find this very funny. Anyway, Turin is saying, I'm going to go serve an elven lord. Because that's what's good, and what's bad is not serving an elven lord. And Sador says, you may learn much of them. They are a fair folk and wonderful, and they have a power over the hearts of men. And yet I think sometimes that it might have been better if we had never met them, but had walked in lowlier ways. For already they are ancient in knowledge. And they are proud and enduring. In their light we are dimmed, or we burn with too quick a flame, and the weight of our doom lies the heavier on us. I think this is one of the more incisive quotes. It's taken from the Unfinished Tales, where the full Narnahinhurin is presented. Because it's like the one occasion where it's made explicit that men might not have preferred to have encountered the elves. Like, the idea that men might not have preferred to have encountered the elves is not even an idea prior to this passage. But I think the Narnahinhurin sort of presents that idea in a story. At any rate, the kingdoms of the elves established in Middle-earth arrive at men. And I think this is related to the extirpation of Valinor in Middle-earth. What do I mean by the extirpation of Valinor in Middle-earth? I mean that whereas in Valinor there is a lord and vassal relationship that involves no conflict of will. Once the elven kingdoms are established in Middle-earth, if you cannot identify the conflict of will anywhere else, then you can identify it between the lords of the kingdoms in Middle-earth. Because the kingdoms in Middle-earth are Gondolin, Doriath, and Nargothrond. Perhaps not coincidentally, men arrive at Gondolin, Doriath, and Nargothrond, and very shortly thereafter they are all destroyed. They do not have a common purpose. It looks like they have a common purpose because they are all in conflict with Melkor, but Melkor is the weather, and saying they have all a conflict, saying they all have a common purpose is much like saying that everyone who experiences a thunderstorm or a tornado and cowers in the basement has a common purpose. People in Kansas cower in a tornado basement, and similarly with people in Mississippi, or I don't know, whatever state. They don't therefore have common purposes. They're all there as if to experience the unfolding of their conflict with Melkor. You have Thingol and Melian, who they tie off the limb as if they hide in the woods, and Melian constructs the girdle of Melian, which denies access to anyone. Gondolin is constructed. I mean, it's kind of difficult to imagine nowadays, but it's constructed in a hard-to-find valley in the mountains. I mean, Melkor had access to dragons who could fly, and every manner of flying beast. So you kind of have to imagine Gondolin as being defended by the gods, because the world is not so large that you can't find a civilization hiding in a valley between mountains, right? But anyway, Gondolin is constructed in a sort of bowl surrounded by mountains, and Nargothrond is, so far as I recall, constructed on the west coast. And these are the kingdoms of elves, and they do not have a common purpose. They all came over due to the suggestion by Feanor that we're going to get the silmarils back. But even back at the first kinslaying, you have people who, like Galadriel is a good example of this. Galadriel was present at the first kinslaying, but she wasn't there because she was following Feanor's dream of getting the silmarils back. Galadriel was there because she was tired of the way things worked in Valinor, and she wanted her own kingdom. So as represented by Galadriel, we see that presence at the first kinslaying, and therefore presence at the first taking of boats across the sea, is not just by the sons of Feanor, or fanatics of the Silmarils. It's anyone who was in Valinor and was thinking, my dreams are across the sea. They arrived at the first kinslaying and they took the boats. Heroic morality in the many elven kingdoms. Incidentally, I would have a picture of Galadriel with a moving frame across it so as to indicate movement. But I don't think that actually contributes anything to what I'm trying to say. Imagining a picture of Galadriel with the frame moving slowly across it would not induce in me saying anything more interesting than I'm already saying, so it's kind of pointless. Anyway, when I was making these notes, apparently I thought it was funny that Tuor arrived at Gondolin, and then shortly thereafter it was destroyed. Turin, but maybe more importantly Beren, arrived at Doriath, and shortly thereafter it was destroyed. Turin arrived at Nargothrond, and shortly thereafter it was destroyed. But I put these in parentheses because parentheses are an indication that this might not be something that I want to pursue. Oh, here. Okay. The lordship structure taken from Valinor and transposed over men. Alright, so this is a further out observation that I may not be able to textually support as well as I would hope. But we have as referent the lordship structures of Valinor, where there was no conflict of will present, even though there was the issuance of commands. And this probably is why I raised this quote up here. You have the lords of the elves who were present in Valinor, and then they arrived in Middle-earth. And early on in the Silmarillion, what the elves encounter are the men passing west from the east. There's no explanation for why they're passing east, and indeed, if I might be able to find this before I run out of hemming and hawing. Let's see. No, I'm not gonna find it. Well, okay, men are passing out of the east. They're going west. In the context of the story, this is presented as if there is an irresistible draw to the west. Every child of Iluvatar wants to arrive in Valinor. Maybe more realistically, there's a large and growing population of men in the east and south, and they just want to explore. I mean, there's no knowing this because the Legendarium doesn't discuss the men in the east and the south, except to point at them occasionally. Right, during the War of the Ring. In the Lord of the Rings, Sauron controls men from Harad and Khand, where Middle-earth is kind of like Europe. Look at the map. And there are these men to the east and the south. And we don't know anything about them. Kind of forgot what point I was pursuing. But anyway, you have this lordship structure where the elves, there are lord elves and there are vassal elves. And so long as they're in Valinor, there's no real conflict between them. The issuing of commands is received and acted upon with no conflict arising within any vassal elf. No vassal elf says, no, this is a thing I don't want to do. Right? But this exact structure for the issuing and receiving of commands and the story between the issuing and the receiving of commands is transposed exactly over men. The men that the elves encounter in Middle-earth. And so, the first men who passed west over the mountains are taken up by this command structure. The extirpation of Valinor in Middle-earth